Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today my good friend, Jen Richler. Hey, Jen, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Jeremy. I feel like this is like the old days when we would co-host our podcast together.
That's right.
It's
Jen
just
and I
like
have
old
quite
times.
quite a podcasting history together. We used to do a show called the B Town Lowdown, all about our home, the place where we live, Bloomington, Indiana. We worked on the Association for Jewish Studies podcast
Mm,
together, the
true.
Frankly Judaic podcast,
Mm-hmm.
which I am still doing. So Jen, I brought you on the show obviously because you're a fellow podcast producer. Just introduce yourself, say, who you are and what you're doing currently.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jen Richler, and I currently am producing a podcast for an organization called the Jewish Women's Archive that's based out of Boston. And I produce their podcast, which is called Can We Talk? It's a Joan Rivers reference, I believe.
Can we
And
talk?
yeah, can we talk?
Yeah.
So the podcast is all about sort of things that are at the intersection of, Judaism, Jewish history, feminism, gender, kind of anything that fits that Venn diagram.
Mm-hmm.
And so oftentimes that means that the format varies a little bit, but it usually involves an interview, at least one interview,
Mm-hmm.
and then some narration too, some scripted narration, but like an interview, at least one interview is usually like part of the format. And like our episodes tend to run like 20 to 25 minutes, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more.
These are podcasts that feature you in discussion with a subject matter expert on whatever the topic
Right.
is. And that's why I wanted to bring you on the show, because this show is all about a different kind of podcasting, like B2B, business to business branded podcasting. And uh, in for that kind of podcast, it really hinges on finding good subject matter experts and
Mm-hmm.
working with them, interviewing them to get really good content. So I brought you on the show because you have a lot of experience working with subject matter experts. Not in the B2B world, but for the podcast you do. But I think the
Right.
same basic principles apply. So that's what I want to talk about. All
Mm-hmm.
about how do you get the most from the experts that you're talking to. And let's just start at the very beginning. I mean, before you can talk to a subject matter expert, you have to find them, and invite them to do an interview, right? So, how do you go about finding a subject matter expert in the first place?
So that's, yeah, it varies a fair bit because sometimes the idea is built around a particular person that we would love to interview. Probably in our case, a Jewish woman or who's doing something interesting. And so sometimes we want to interview that person.
Hmm.
And so, it's really kind of built around the person comes first
So
in
it's
terms of,
obvious who you want to
so
reach
it's
out to.
obvious.
Yeah.
If it's more about a topic, I mean, again, sometimes that's what sparks the idea in the first place. So, like, we did an episode recently about Jews in the spiritualist movement, which is like a time in the late 19th, early 20th century when Jewish women were very prominent in the movement that was like leading seances, like they were
Hmm.
mediums,
Hmm.
and they were particularly like well known for that and for advancing the spiritualist movement. And the way that idea came about in the first place was that my co-producer had heard someone give a lecture about that topic, and he seemed interesting like that, so we
Hmm.
interviewed him. And so like the idea came from hearing that guy talk, so he seemed like the natural
Hmm.
choice. Sometimes, and I'm trying to think of a good example, but there are times if we want it, if we have an idea we want to cover, then it's a matter of finding who's going to talk about that topic in
Yeah.
the most interesting way. And I mean, some of it is like, being plugged into sort of who are key people in certain topic areas. And like, my production team, and especially the CEO of my company, like of my organization, like, it, it networks a lot
Yeah.
with people in that world. So she kind of at her fingertips is like, oh, well, we could talk to this person, and we could talk to this person, and this person knows a lot about X or Y. But I mean, sometimes a good old fashioned just like internet search is not a bad way to go. It still works.
Yeah. Hmm.
But it's just like I think sometimes in my case, it's like being somewhat knowledgeable about the subject matter to begin with kind of provides the leads.
Hmm. Okay, so you'll have some idea of kind of who's out there, or like you
Yeah,
say, at the very least, you can do a Google search and see who turns up, and then look into them a little bit and make sure they seem like a good fit. So
right.
another question then, um, once you found an expert and they've agreed to do the interview, how do you prepare?
So, usually a fair bit of reading. Like, let's say if they have written a lot on the topic that they're expert on, then I read things they've written. I've read things that are related to their topic of expertise because that's going to help me write good interview questions, right? Like really informed interview questions where getting beyond sort of having them talk in very broad strokes. So, I mean, especially if they've written a book or, I might not read the whole book, but I'm going to read parts of it so that I can like, in an interview point to things they've said or written as like jumping off points for questions.
Hmm.
So yeah, I do a fair bit of reading, or if they've, given talks, I might watch bits of talks on YouTube that they've given. That also helps me see like sort of what their speaking style is and like is a good way to vet them a bit in terms of are they engaging? Do they talk in an
Yeah.
engaging way? Um yeah, so those are, I do a lot of reading um and sort of gathering the information about them and their subject matter that I can so that I can write good questions.
Okay, so you kind of learn enough so you can, as you said, write, appropriate questions, and so you can carry on, like legitimately have a discussion, even though you're not an expert in the topic necessarily, certainly
Right.
not to the degree that the guest is, but you know enough to ask good questions and be able to have a good conversation.
Right. And I mean because the podcast isn't geared to experts, it's geared to
Yeah,
people who are, interested but maybe hearing about a certain topic for the first time or something. So it's you don't want it to be pitched at a super like, expert level. It's
yeah,
not a podcast for it. So that works out what, you don't actually want to know too much or sound like you know too much because um like it's geared at more of an intro level
yeah.
in
Okay,
terms of
so it
our
depends on the
audience.
audience, right? So
Yeah,
in the case of
yeah.
your audience, right, that makes sense. And if it was geared at a more expert audience, like an audience of academics or whatever, then you'd
Hmm.
probably get more in the weeds,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
you'd just be able to have a different kind of conversation.
Right.
So, do you do a prep call with the guests?
I mean, it depends. If it's someone that's like a very well-known entity and like the whole episode is built around them, then no, because like we probably want to do the episode because we know that they're really interesting and maybe have heard them talk before. And so it's like less likely that it would be something would come out of a pre-interview that would make us not want to do it.
Hmm.
Um, but sometimes, I mean, for subject matter experts, I guess, who are really unknown entities to us, like it is useful to do a little bit of a pre-interview. I have to say I haven't done it as I think I did it more in when I used to edit a more academic podcast, the one that you worked on the
Yeah,
Association for Jewish Studies. Whereas now, like I think often the episodes are like shaped around people we know or have seen in action, and so it doesn't happen as much. But I think like if you really don't know anything about this person's way of talking and imparting information, then you would want to um,
yeah,
have
yeah,
some opportunity to vet that.
yeah. I mean, I typically like doing prep calls just because even if I know the person, even if I'm pretty well versed on the topic, just to, well, for a couple of reasons. One, just to kind of touch base, and especially if it's someone I've never met before, just to interact a little bit, get to
Hmm.
know each other a little bit, and also to discuss the topic, not and it's to being careful not to get to go too far because you want it to be
Yeah.
fresh for the actual interview,
Yeah.
but to sort of give the guest a chance to say, well, here's how I might approach it, or especially if it's we're not we're going to be recording for a specific amount of time, which is
Mhm.
usually the case,
Mhm.
so that I'm, at least for me, so I'm have a little bit more control, that when we go in we kind of know, okay, well, we're going to be talking about this subject and
Mhm.
kind of focusing on these three things,
Mhm.
and within that there's still room to kind of see
Mhm.
where things go, but at least to
Right.
have a bit more focus. I like doing that, but I think it just depends on the kind of podcast that you're creating and who you're
Yeah,
talking
and
to.
unfortunately sometimes it also comes down to time. Like,
Sure.
it's just sometimes hard enough to schedule an interview with someone, and so trying to find that time for that extra interaction
Yeah.
can be challenging. I mean, I have had those kind of preliminary conversations. Usually it's people I already know are probably going to be the guest on the podcast, so I'm not doing it as much to vet them, but just to kind of have a preliminary conversation. But like you
Yeah.
said, I don't want to get too far into the conversation about the topic at hand because I want to save that for the when we're recording.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So when you're recording,
Mhm.
um what are you trying to keep sort of top of mind? And I ask this because, in my experience, especially if you are filling a few different roles, you're the interviewer
Mhm.
and you're kind of running the recording session, right?
Yeah.
And in in my case, I believe in your case, most of the interviews are remote, right? Or maybe all of
Mhm.
them are.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and so, you're kind of the recording engineer, you're the interviewer, you're the host of a podcast if you're like, doing that kind
Mhm.
of thing. It's a lot. I find it's a lot to keep in mind and kind of
Yeah.
juggle.
Yeah.
So how do you approach the interview? Like what's your strategy for going into an interview and giving giving it the best chance to produce really good content?
Yeah, I mean, I think that trying to make sure you're well prepared so that I think because basically you want to feel as relaxed as you can given all of what you just said, it's not going to be totally relaxing, but you want to convey a relaxed disposition because I think that's going to put the guest at ease. And you really want the guest to sound at ease because they're going to be more engaging if they're not really tense and kind of worried about how they're sounding. And
Yeah.
so I think things will always go wrong with audio glitches and whatever, but trying to prepare in advance that you've like checked things and you've checked that the right mic is selected and
Yeah.
but then when things kind of come up, being relaxed about it so that it doesn't stress the other person out. Because I think sometimes, especially experts, I mean, maybe if they're always called on to talk about their expertise and they're really used to it, then they will be more relaxed. But if they're not, they can be kind of understandably a bit tense.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think if you can put them at ease and um yeah, I think you can do a lot of that in your own tone and demeanor, and um I also usually, again, if they're very experienced, they're going to sort of know all of this spiel, although I usually give it anyway, but part of it is that, like, to remember that this is not live,
Mm-hmm.
and so if they say something and they don't like the way it came out, they can try again. They can be like, "Oh wait, that's not quite what I meant. Can I say that again?" And that they should
Mm-hmm.
know that they can do that. I think kind of relaxes them too. Um,
Mm-hmm.
because otherwise they might feel like they have one shot to like get it perfect, and that can make them feel tense too. So I think that can be reassuring to tell them, like, this is just it's just a conversation basically.
Yeah.
um yeah, those are sort of my main, as like my guiding principle, is to sort of
Mm-hmm.
try to get them relaxed and do what I can to set that tone in the
Yeah.
interview.
Yeah. By the way, that's another reason why I like doing prep calls, because I think it helps relax people. And,
Yeah.
it's a way to talk about the subject a little bit beforehand
Yeah.
without the pressure of like, okay, we're
We're
recording,
rolling.
you know.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I totally agree. Some people do get nervous, and it's understandable. Like you said, if you haven't done a ton of this, people don't want to, maybe are worried about coming off poorly,
Mm-hmm.
or saying the wrong thing, and so
Mm-hmm.
all those things, to reassure them, like, I'll edit it, I'll make sure you
Right.
sound great. If it's
Right.
video, I'll make sure you look good, and all that. And then, I find typically, if you as the producer have done a good enough job in that, once you hit record and you start having the conversation, the guest will often report later on, like, wow, that just flew by. You
Mm-hmm.
you even kind of forget that you're being recorded. You're just sort of
Yeah.
engrossed in the conversation,
Yeah. Right. Right.
you know?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've been doing this for a while now. Uh, what have you learned over time about what doesn't work, what not to do when you're working with subject matter experts?
One thing that comes to mind is just, and I think people have different feelings about this. I do not like sending guests questions.
Hmm.
I'm firmly in the don't do that camp. And the reason is that I think because the other thing I think can happen with especially with experts is that they can sometimes sound very rehearsed and scripted and jargony in the way they talk, because they're sort of used to talking in like sort of catchphrases or the lingo of of whatever industry or field they're in. And I think that sending them questions encourages them to do that more. Um, I think sometimes they'll write out their answers and you can tell when they're reading them. I mean, you can always tell when
Mm-hmm.
someone is reading in a podcast instead of just talking. And it's
Yeah.
a real peeve of mine. Um, in general, as a listener, I don't want to hear people read stuff unless there's a good reason why. But I don't want something that is supposed to sound conversational sound scripted. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it is, first of all, if it will put the guest at ease, and so like it shouldn't be like some big mystery about what you're going to ask, and maybe a pre-call can sort of accomplish some of that because you're giving them a taste of what the interview will be. I think you can always tell them, I'll generally be asking you X, Y, and Z. I just
Mm-hmm.
don't like to send people lists of questions. I
Mm-hmm.
find that that's just makes it feel less conversational, and that
Mm-hmm.
I don't want them to over prepare, like they're an
Yeah.
expert in this subject, and so they should be able to just talk about it. It's not like
Yeah.
there's not going to be like a gotcha moment in the kind of interviews I do, at least. I'm not doing like
Right. Right.
investigative journalism, in which case, I mean, you definitely wouldn't want to send them the
Right.
questions, but
Right.
like I don't want anyone to worry that that's what it's going to feel like at all, that I'm going to like put them on the spot. But I also think, because like sometimes the element of surprise can be nice in an interview, not
Mm-hmm.
surprise like, oh my god, we're getting into something really heavy and I can't believe you didn't warn me, but in the like, oh, huh, I hadn't thought of that kind of way, that
Mm-hmm.
that has a certain spontaneity to it, that like if you send that to them ahead of time. So I mean, the other thing you can do is send them like sort of a subset of questions, or say something just in case they're going to be picky with you about it, and be like, this isn't a comprehensive exhaustive list of what I'm going to ask you, but here's an idea.
Yeah.
If
Mm-hmm.
you feel like it's really going to make them feel better. I find like most of my guests are pretty easygoing. I do think like
Mm-hmm.
when I've worked with academics more, that they often like to feel more prepared, but they're also like some of the most vulnerable to the talking and jargon problem. And
Right.
so
Right.
I'll usually, if they ask me for questions, I'll write them back with I will be asking you X, Y, and Z kind of thing. And that seems to do the trick.
Calm their fears. Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting. It's funny. I almost always send questions to guests, and I sent you questions.
Yeah. And
but
I
but but but
mean,
I did
yeah,
it in
I
a
didn't write down answers.
right, and I emailed you a few, like, I'm with you, if especially for the kind of podcast that we produce and that we produce for ourselves too. They're they keep the questions minimal and really straightforward. So it's not like I'm sending a list of 20 questions and for people to pore over. Um, but I like doing it just to, I find generally speaking, people tend to appreciate it. And you're right, of course, that you do not want people writing out the answers and then reading them, sort of performing them, because that, unless
Mm-hmm.
they're like a trained actor, that's just going to sound horrible. Even if they are a trained actor, probably won't be that great because it's not a real conversation then. Um, I think though, as long as you make it clear, you say, look, I'll send you a couple, some questions, give you the gist of what we're going to talk about. Um, but just be sure to, and it's even okay for you to jot down some stuff. Just don't be reading answers when we record. And I'll say that sometimes. Um, but you definitely, it's true. I've done interviews where people have done that,
Mm-hmm.
in and
Mm-hmm.
it's once they've already done it and that's what they've expected. It's hard to stop it and be like, you
Yeah.
can't do that now. But it
Yeah.
really does ruin the interview. That's true.
Yeah.
So, okay, Jen. Well, uh, what's your for people who are maybe less experienced at working with subject matter experts, and a lot of our customers, the folks we work with, marketing leaders, they often are working with subject matter experts at their companies to get their expertise and get their knowledge to
Mm.
write blog posts or whatever. If you're a little bit less experienced with this, what would be your main takeaway? Like, what's the main thing you want folks to take away from this episode when it comes to having a good experience working with subject matter experts?
I guess just to try to approach it like you would any engaging conversation, like that the goal is to have a good conversation with someone who knows about something. But I guess it can cut both ways. That I guess the host can be intimidated too by the subject matters, the experts expertise, or if they're at all a high profile name, then that doesn't happen to me very often. But there can be an intimidation factor that makes you as the interviewer clam up a bit. And just to try to remember, you're just talking, and why you're doing this in the first place is that, like, people like hearing interesting conversations between people
Yeah.
who are like have this common interest in something. And that if you like, it's less like so many cardinal rules of you must do this or you must not do this, as much as just like setting that tone. um and I guess if you come at it from that angle, then I think that will guide some of the choices you make. So, like, don't be afraid to, if you don't if you think something that the guest said wasn't totally clear, probably other people are going to think that too. And, you're going to be going to cut the tape and you're going to be like, oh, this is what you have to work with now. So if you think something they said wasn't totally clear, you can say, I'm not sure what you mean. Or can you explain what you mean by X or Y? Or say a little more about
Yeah.
that. Like, it's okay to probe like that. And you're likely to get a better answer when you just dig a little bit deeper and get them, it
Hmm.
might get them again to talk more like a regular person. So yeah, not to be
Yeah.
afraid to say, like, what do you mean? um
Hmm. Yeah. Great.
there's even something that, I mean, it's not just with subject matter experts, but something I've noticed I do and I'm trying to do less, um is like, just remember that you've asked them, they've agreed to do this conversation with you, so they know you're going to ask them questions. So you don't need to like apologize for that by having like a long preamble to your question. So I sometimes catch myself
Mm.
saying things like, I wonder if you could say what you think about X or Y, when it would be much better to just say, what do you think about X or
Yeah.
Y? And
Right.
don't deal, don't have all these little like wind ups to your questions that I think
Hmm.
subconsciously is like, it's like this sort of shyness about just coming out and asking them. But like, it's an interview. You're supposed to ask them questions and they're supposed to answer them. And you're not being too forward by being like, tell me about X.
That's
That's
why
like
they've.
why they're there. So,
That's why they're there. Yeah.
like, to try to just uh, talk, the way that you would talk in a conversation, and
Yeah.
something as simple as, "What do you mean?" And you'll hear that. I actually feel like I was just just heard an interview on NPR where the host said, "What do you mean?" And
Hmm.
something as simple as that, I think,
Yeah,
I mean, first of all, people say that in conversation all the time. And so it
sure.
sounds conversational instead of like, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you mean by that,
Right.
which you would not say to like a friend of yours.
It's too
And
formal.
it's
Right.
too formal, it's too stuffy. So try to talk the way you would talk in a conversation
Hmm.
and treat the guest with obviously with respect and with due respect for their expertise and all of that, but still not, don't handle them differently because of their expertise or because it's a podcast. Like try to just talk to them.
Yeah, really good advice. Well, finally, Jen, how can people connect with you?
You can find the Jewish Women's Archive
Hmm.
um, on Instagram, Facebook. We have a very active TikTok, actually.
Oh, nice.
So that's another place to find us with a lot of fun stuff. And like all our podcast episodes are posted there. And then on our website, which is jwa.org. So you
Okay.
can find all my stuff there.
Okay. Excellent. We'll put some links to all that in the show notes. And well, thank you, Jen, so much. It's always fun to talk, and thanks
Yeah,
for coming on the show.
maybe I'll see you around.